Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube, and you are listening to me here on the On Centerline podcast, available on all major podcast providers. Thanks for joining me today, everybody. We are getting started today with something that's been highly requested by many of you who I am so grateful have had such a positive response to my ACS breakdown for the private pilot check ride, the private pilot oral, where we went through the whole ACS and broke everything down line item by line item for your private pilot check ride. And I've gotten so many messages from all of you as to how it's helped you with your check ride and how much you have appreciated it. And I appreciate that so much. So thank you all for the support, and I'm glad that it has been helpful. So today we're getting started with the instrument pilot ACS breakdown. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to mirror the private pilot breakdown, and I won't be making episodes necessarily for every section, because some sections are pretty much just one-to-one copies of the private pilot breakdown. There may be some things that kind of get amended or added when we get into the instrument side of things. So I'll be making episodes that kind of cover those changes or the differences from private to instrument. But a lot of it is the same. And so we're just going to primarily start adding on to what we already talked about in the private and just expand it to the instrument world. So today we're getting started with our pilot qualifications. We're looking in the ACS here. This is Area of Operation 1, Pre-Flight Procedures, Task A, Pilot Qualifications in your Instrument Pilot ACS. As always, we're going to read through every line item and speak to it as necessary. Our objective here is to determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with requirements to act as pilot in command under instrument flight rules. So as opposed to what we were doing in the private realm, that was all visual flight rules. Now we're in the instrument flight rules realm. All right, your knowledge items. It says the applicant demonstrates understanding of certification requirements, recency of experience, and record keeping. All right, guys, this is really the meat and potatoes of this section. Certification requirements, recency of experience, and record keeping. Okay. So first of all, certification requirements. What do you need to have done to qualify to take this instrument pilot check ride? Well, the main things are you're going to need at least 40 hours of instrument time. Now, that can be a combination of simulated instrument time under a hood or a view limiting device and actual instrument experience, which is always the best. And if you have not had the opportunity to get out into actual conditions, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you find a way to do so. I know it's not as easy for everyone if you're doing flight training in Arizona or something like that. But if you're able to travel somewhere else where you're able to get some actual experience, it makes all the difference in the world. And it is completely different than just simulating instrument conditions. So it can be a combination, though, that 40 hours can be a combination of simulated and actual conditions. And up to 20 hours of it could even be done in a flight simulator that's approved, an approved flight simulation training device. I do utilize simulators for my IFR students. I don't typically do 20 hours worth because while they do have their place and are very useful tools, they are not the same as flying the plane. And I don't find it to be particularly helpful in really gaining the kind of end of game, the skills that we want to see at the end there. So certainly for introductory tasks and things like that, it really goes a long way because it's hard to learn in the airplane. So we can learn a lot better in the simulator, and we use that up front in training a lot. But for most students, I don't use it the 20 hours. We might do 5 to 7 hours tops in the simulator. And usually they're going to hit 40 hours of instrument time in an airplane anyway. So those simulator hours aren't even usually needed, but it depends on the student. All right, so 40 hours of instrument time. You also are going to need 50 hours of PIC cross-country time. Now, this means that you need to have 50 hours of PIC cross-country that could have been somewhat done, at least, in your private training. Anytime you were doing your cross-country solos for your private certificate, that would count towards this PIC cross-country time, okay, because you were PIC for those cross-countries. However, any cross-countries you did with your instructor while training for your private certificate would not count because you were not PIC. So most people are going to have at least 5 hours of cross-country time coming into their instrument training because that's what's required for your private certificate. And some of you might even have more. But there's going to be at least, 30 plus hours of PIC cross-country time building that most people have to do. And the best way to do this, if we're talking strictly about building this PIC cross-country time, the best way to do this is to go out with friends and family who can pay their pro rata share and can split the cost with you. That's going to be the most affordable way. However, you can also go out with other pilots, and one of you can be under the hood at any given time, the other person acting as your safety pilot. That way, both of you get to log PIC time. However, only the person under the hood doing the flying can log the cross-country. So there are some pros and cons to it. Basically, you can log cross-country when you're actually flying. You do the takeoff and the landing at the destination. And then the person who is safety pilot can log the PIC time for all the time that other pilot is under the hood. And I have a video on this and how to log it properly right here. I'll put it up here in the cards for those of you watching on YouTube. Check out this video. It is extremely important that you are logging this time correctly. All right. So you can split it with a safety pilot. And then, of course, you will be doing plenty of hours with a CFII receiving training under the hood and on instruments. However, you only need 15 hours. Okay, so you need minimum 15 hours with a CFII of training in order to qualify for this instrument check ride. Okay, I personally try to incorporate as much cross-country time into our training as I can. That way, my students are getting kind of the most for their money. They're getting the training, but they're also getting the cross-country PIC hours. So we're trying to fill up both buckets at once, filling up the instrument time as well as the PIC cross-country time. All right. Okay, moving on to recency of experience. And this is a big one. So many people don't quite understand this. If we look up in the regulations in part 61, we're going to pull up part 6157. 6157, recency of experience for pilot in command. It says that for instrument experience, this is subpart C, except as provided in paragraph E of this section, a person may act as pilot in command under IFR or weather conditions less than the minimums prescribed for VFR only if, in an airplane, that pilot within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight has performed and logged at least the following tasks and iterations in an airplane. That would be, number 1, 6 instrument approaches. Number 2, holding procedures and tasks. And number 3, intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. Okay, so basically we need to do 6 approaches and at least 1 hold procedure. Yes, you need to intercept and track courses off of electronic navigational systems. that's mostly inherent in just the process of doing these approaches, especially if you're doing them in a real airplane. That would really only apply if you were kind of trying to cheat the system on a simulator, just setting yourself up on the final approach course on an ILS in a sim and just resetting it each time and just flying it straight in. That wouldn't count. Okay. But other than that, it's pretty much inherent to the process if you're doing this in an airplane. So 6 approaches and holding procedures within the 6 calendar months preceding the month of the flight. So what does this mean? It means that if we, let's say, do, and this was actually a question that I posed here on the YouTube channel a couple weeks ago. If we log 3 approaches in January and 3 approaches in February with, let's say, 1 hold in February, as of what date would your instrument currency be expired? So if we look forward, well, January is first month, February is second month, March, April, May, June. So June would be the 6 months, okay? Now, that means if we get into July, that's the 7th month. But remember, the regulation states that you must have done these 6 approaches and holds in the 6 months preceding the month of the flight. So if we're in July, we can look at the previous 6 months, June, May, April, March, February, January, and we can still find 6 approaches and a hold. So realistically, we could go all the way through to the end of July, July 31st, and still be able to look at the 6 months preceding that month to find that we've met the currency requirements. It's only as of actually August 1st, the first day of the 8th month, that we can no longer look at the preceding 6 months and find enough approaches or holds to qualify for currency. At that point, we would need to do at least 3 more approaches because all we have in the preceding 6 months is 3 approaches and a hold. Okay? So we always need to look at the 6 months preceding the month of the flight to know whether or not we meet currency standards. Now, what happens if we go beyond that 6 months? Well, we can still, on August 1st, go out and do those approaches that we need with a safety pilot. You can grab a friend, a buddy, another pilot, whoever, as long as they're appropriately certificated and rated to come and be our safety pilot. We can knock out those 3 approaches or whatever it is, and you can gain your currency back. Okay? And you can do that for the next 6 months. Because then it goes on, if we read the regulation, let's see here. If we look at subpart D, instrument proficiency check, it says, except as provided in paragraph E, a person who has failed to meet the instrument experience requirements of paragraph C of this section for more than 6 calendar months may reestablish instrument currency only by completing an instrument proficiency check. And the instrument proficiency check needs to include the area's operation contained in the applicable ACS. That's all in the ACS. You can find that. We might talk about that later. But basically this IPC, as we call it, the instrument proficiency check, needs to be done at that point with a CFII, a qualified flight instructor. And it essentially covers everything that's on the instrument check ride. Again, sometimes this can be knocked out and done in as little as 1 flight. And other times it takes a few flights, depending on how long you've kind of been out of the game. Okay. But basically it says if you failed to meet the instrument experience requirements of this section for more than 6 calendar months. So again, as of August 1st, we are no longer current. So now we have 6 months: August, September, October, November, December, January. Remember, our earliest approaches were in the previous January. So now it has to be more than 6 months, meaning we have until February 1st, before we actually have to do an IPC. Okay, so basically you'd be looking at the previous 12 months before the month of the flight. But as of February 1st, you have now been out of currency for more than 6 months because you were out of currency as of August 1st. And now it's been more than 6 months. So now, as of February 1st of that next year, you will need to do an IPC with an instructor. Okay? So that's our recency of experience. Lastly, we're looking at record keeping. Of course, you need to log this stuff in your logbook. As with anything you log in your logbook, the bare minimum is the things that you need to that are required for currency. In other words, these 6 approaches and a hold, these need to be logged along with the appropriate flights and of course the instructor if they're with you, or the appropriate safety pilot. If the safety pilot was with you, you need to have the name of a safety pilot that you were with. Okay. And in order to log these approaches for the purpose of currency, if you are in simulated conditions, meaning under the hood or in a simulator, a flight training device, you need to fly these approaches all the way to minimums. However, if you are in actual conditions, you only need to fly the approach to the final approach fix while being in actual instrument conditions. As long as you break out of actual instrument conditions after the final approach fix, you can record that approach for the purposes of currency. Okay? So it's important to know what you can log for the purposes of currency and how to log it appropriately. All right, guys, moving on. Privileges and limitations of the instrument pilot. Many of these things, actually, you know what? Before we go on to this real quickly, I just want to add that going back to our recency of experience, keep in mind that all the same things that we talk about in recency of experience for private pilot, just to fly VFR, still apply. You still need 3 takeoffs and landings in the previous 90 days if you're going to be taking passengers, and you still need a flight review every 24 calendar months at minimum, okay, in order to act as PIC. So remember, those things still apply. These are just the things that come in addition to being an instrument pilot if you're going to act as PIC under instrument conditions. All right, moving on to our privileges and limitations. So what can you do as an instrument-rated pilot that you couldn't do before? Well, one of the simple answers is you can fly in weather conditions that are less than VFR. You can file an IFR flight plan. You can act as PIC under an IFR flight plan in instrument conditions. You can fly in Class Alpha airspace if your plane is able to get up there. And beyond that, really, there's just some more privileges, particularly when it comes to being a commercial pilot, that takes off restrictions. If you were to not be instrument rated as a commercial pilot, be limited to how far you can fly for hire with passengers, and that you could not fly at night. Those restrictions would be lifted with that instrument rating. So now let's move on to the next section of the knowledge area, which is Part 68, BasicMed Privileges and Limitations. So to put it simply, BasicMed we talked about in the private pilot breakdown, but when it comes to being an instrument pilot, you can fly under instrument flight rules, having only BasicMed. However, you cannot do certain things like fly over 250 knots. You can also not fly into Class Alpha airspace, even if you're IFR rated, okay? So you can't fly above 18,000 feet. You can't fly over 250 knots. And then, of course, the same limitations that still apply to BasicMed, like the number of passengers and things like that. Some of those rules actually have recently changed or are about to change. I don't know if they've actually been implemented yet, but you'll want to review those changes to BasicMed, and maybe we'll do a future podcast on that once I'm sure that they've been implemented. We'll talk about what those changes look like. Okay, moving on, guys, to our risk management. The applicant is able to identify, assess, and mitigate risk associated with proficiency versus currency. So, same thing we talk about as a private pilot or any other, commercial pilot. It's always It always comes down to two things. It comes down to what is legal versus what is safe. Okay? Currency equals legal. Proficiency equals safety. Okay? Remember that for every check ride you ever take. Remember, it always comes down to those two things. What is legal? What is safe? So, when we're talking about proficiency versus currency with instruments, this is a highly, highly perishable skill, folks. It's not enough to just maintain your 6 hits, your 6 approaches in a hold in the past 6 months, okay? Currency in this regard rarely ever goes far enough to maintain proficiency. And, it's almost harder when it comes to risk management with being instrument rated to make good, safe, go, no-go decisions and to have those. It's really important to have those personal minimums laid out, which we're going to talk about. Because, when you're a VFR-only pilot, it's pretty easy to make those go, no-go decisions. You look at the weather. If it's blue skies and sunny, and you look at the METARs and they're all green, 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 and show VFR, well, you're probably good to go. And if it's blue and shows marginal, well, maybe not. And certainly if it's red or purple, magenta, in those METARs showing IFR or low IFR, well, it's a no-go. Easy as that. Unfortunately, once you're instrument rated, those rules don't apply anymore. Sure, VFR green, go all day. Blue, easy, right? Still 1,000-foot ceilings minimum. 3 miles visibility's minimum. Easy. You're instrument rated. But even now we get to IFR. Turns red or even low IFR. Hey, you can fly an approach to minimums. You've been doing it throughout your whole training. Fly an approach down to 200 feet. 300-foot ceilings, 1 mile visibility, easy, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. But the point is, red doesn't necessarily mean stop anymore now that you're an instrument-rated pilot. It's up to you to have set very conservative, especially right when you first get your rating, personal minimums to where you don't push it too far, okay? Especially if you have not gotten a significant amount of actual instrument time throughout your training. If the majority or all of your instrument training has been under simulated conditions, you really need to think twice before going in any type of actual conditions, let alone anything anywhere near minimums, okay? So it's important for you to show up to your check ride understanding this, but also having good personal minimums. And by the way, this is our next line item, personal minimums. Having specific personal minimums drawn out on a sheet of paper. You can download the AOPA personal minimums worksheet, something that you can go over with your CFI before your check ride. Both of you sit down and look at the different numbers and what you feel comfortable with, what your CFI feels comfortable with. You both sign off on it and you show up to your check ride with that. So when this subject matter comes up, you pull that sucker out and say, here's my personal minimums, and I don't plan on going below these for, quite some time until I've gained a lot of experience and got some good practice in, and of course, maintaining that proficiency. All right, guys, next line item. We're almost done with this section. This is fitness for flight and physiological factors that might affect the pilot's ability to fly under instrument conditions. So as always, we're using kind of our I am safe checklist to check our own airworthiness as the pilot in command. But there's other things we need to consider, or maybe things we need to consider in a different way when we are flying under instruments. Understanding that any type of head cold or cloudiness in your head can go even further to disorient you when you are in the clouds. That's, this is the reason why we have to spend minimum 40 hours in instrument conditions in our training to even qualify for this rating, because you need to learn to ignore your body's signals and, fend off disorientation when you don't have visual reference out the window of the airplane. Any type of impairment to that end, whether sickness or anything else, can make these symptoms and cause you to get disoriented even worse. All right, so you really need to be in the right headspace, the right frame of mind. It is very mentally taxing for any flight, but let alone one in the instrument environment. Things happen fast. You need to be on your game, both in your piloting skills and mentally being able to keep up with what's going on. Okay, so that's fitness for flight and physiological factors that might affect the pilot's ability to fly under instrument conditions. Again, any type of inner ear infection, any type of ailment that could affect your vestibular system can only lead to even worse disorientation, which can make piloting an aircraft under instrument conditions even harder. So something to consider. Next is flying unfamiliar aircraft or operating with unfamiliar flight display systems and avionics. This comes into play so much when we're talking about instrument flying. Guys, if you are in an aircraft, even if it's the same aircraft maybe you did all your training in a 172, but you did all that training in a 172 with, let's say, maybe even a G1000 or at the very least a hybrid cockpit. So many of our planes these days have the G5s, which are kind of like a hybrid, PFD, along with some steam gauges. We have our GPS that goes a long way to making our jobs a lot easier. If you tried to get into another 172, maybe the same make and model, but it has full steam gauges, no PFD, no G5s, no GPS maybe. Maybe it's just got your CDI for your VOR and ILS. Maybe it even has an ADF. Okay, but maybe it doesn't have a GPS. That is almost a completely different type of flying and not something you can simply step into. And it's important for you to realize that. And it goes both ways. Maybe you are proficient on steam gauges and you step into a plane that has a glass display, whether it's full glass or hybrid. That, again, two different types of flying, something you need to be aware of and that you don't rush into without proper training. Okay. When it comes to multi-engine training at Twin Oaks, our Apache that we have is a great plane, but it does have a very simple steam gauge cockpit. No G5s or anything like that. It does have a GPS, which is nice, a nice 650. But unlike all of our 172s that have to some extent, some glass in the cockpit, the Apache doesn't have that. And so one of the main things I stress to all my students before they start multi-engine training is they need to be proficient in instrument flying on steam gauges. And we have one plane, one 172, that actually is kind of outfitted the same way as the Apache instrument-wise. So I tell them, hey, take Hotel Charlie out, do a couple approaches, make sure you are comfortable and proficient flying the approach on those steam gauges before we jump into the Apache, which is twice as much per hour. All right, so knowing the difference in different types of avionics, making sure you have proper training and that you're proficient, not just on the airframe itself, but on whatever equipment is in that panel, is extremely important when we get into IFR flying. All right, guys, lastly, skills. The applicant exhibits the skill to apply requirements to act as pilot in command under instrument flight rules in a scenario given by the evaluator. Again, pretty straightforward. All this is saying, as with all check rides, the examiner is going to strive to present a scenario for you to speak to these things within, right? It's not just question and answer. It's not just, hey, how many approaches do you have to do in the last 6 months to maintain currency? It's not that. It's similar to maybe what I kind of described earlier on, where he says, hey, let's say you did 2 approaches in January, and then, February was a cold month. There was a lot of icing, so you didn't fly then. But in March, you did 3 more approaches. And then in April, you did 1 approach and 1 hold. And then, it slowed down. Maybe you got busy, so you didn't fly for a while, didn't do any instrument stuff because now the weather's getting better. And you're doing mostly VFR flying. So now fall starts coming around to September, October. You want to go on this flight. Are you current to do so? Okay, that's the type of scenario that is just an example they might present it in. So all this stuff is going to be scenario based. And that's why it's just so critical to understand it, to understand all of this at its fundamental level. Because it's not going to be just rote memorization. It's not going to be question and answer. You have to be able to understand it and apply this knowledge to the scenario that's given to you by the examiner. All right. So, folks, that is your pilot qualifications for your instrument pilot ACS breakdown. All right. We're going to continue on with this over the coming weeks, months. I'm going to fit these in as I'm able. We're going to revisit sections again that we've already covered in the private pilot ACS breakdown, but we will be amending them and adding on things that are specific to the instrument rating. Let me know what you think of this, guys. Leave a comment down below. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.